Sure. Perfect. Wonderful. So welcome to you all. Really wonderful to have you all here. So my name is Emily Clark. I'm a knowledge broker at the National Collaborating Center for Methods and Tools. My training was at McMaster University in health research methodology. I had previously been studying in developmental biology and doing more lab-based research. And I realized that wasn't really the type of work that I wanted to be doing. So I switched to a more public health focus and a knowledge translation focused, and I've really enjoyed it ever since then. I work for one of the 6 national collaborating centers in Canada. We are all funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada, which is our large public health government-funded public health agency for the country, similar to something like the CDC in the United States. We are a little bit unique, though, in that while we are funded by the government and our public health agency, we are a little bit arm's length, and we are able to remain apolitical. We operate fairly independently. I mean, we do need to submit, funding requests and that type of thing, but in terms of the work that we do and the projects that we take on, we are fairly independent. And our scientific director, Dr. Maureen Dobbins, in the School of Nursing at McMaster, is really our final sign-off. So we are unique in that the rapid reviews and the various resources that we produce don't need to go through any type of government approvals or anything like that. So while we're funded by the government, we're able to stay arm's length. This has allowed us to stay a lot more responsive and nimble and acting faster during things like the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'll talk a little bit more about that work as well. So our center is the National Collaborating Center for Methods and Tools in Hamilton, Ontario. We're just south of Toronto in Canada. And there are 5 other national collaborating centers in Canada as well that also operate independently, and we work together as a whole to support public health in Canada and the use of evidence in making decisions in public health in Canada. So it's a really neat structure that I think is fairly unique around the world in the way that we operate. A little bit more about our center in particular. We focus on methods and tools for evidence-informed public health. So what are the methods and tools we can use to mobilize knowledge in the field of public health across Canada? We offer various resources online. You can always check out our website. It's nccmt.ca. I'll type that into the chat real quick. We do offer quite a few free online resources, online learning modules, videos. There's a whole repository or registry of methods and tools that can support knowledge translation. So there's some really fabulous resources on there that are available to anybody around the world. So I do encourage you to check that out. But what we're hoping to do today is focus a little bit more on some of the work that we did in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So while we mostly work on building capacity and teaching for evidence-informed decision-making, when the COVID pandemic hit, nobody had any time for that type of learning and professional development, and everybody just needed answers to all of these questions that everybody had. So we very quickly pivoted and used the skills that we had been teaching and actually applied those to conducting rapid reviews on priority public health questions. We did this, mostly we fielded questions from the Public Health Agency, from our top, our medical officer of health is kind of like the Surgeon General in the States. So we were fielding questions from their office, from their strategic response teams, and we very quickly were so we were very quickly turning out these rapid reviews in a very quick timeline. And what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about that experience and provide some information on how we were able to balance, and we're going to talk about this a lot, balancing rigor with rapid timelines, as well as the different tools that can be used in order to do this. So very, very rough agenda here. I never quite stick to the times exactly, but really what we want to be talking about today is rapid reviews. How do they differ from systematic reviews? What's the trade-off in terms of timeline and rigor? And then we're going to go through the process. So the process will be familiar to everybody who's done or learned about systematic reviews: developing your questions, searching and screening, assessing quality, synthesis, and then preparing that report. But the real focus for this session for all of these steps is going to be, how can you balance methodological rigor and produce the best report and the strongest findings possible while also meeting rapid timelines, and how can you manage that trade-off? And then all the way throughout, we'll talk about different tools that can help you, and some of the tools that we have used along the way. So I do have a practical scenario. I find it sometimes helpful to ground these discussions in a solid scenario. So I'm going to use a scenario that we encountered back in 2021 for one of the reviews that we were asked to do. I'm happy to take questions throughout. Feel free to pop them into chat. And if you're comfortable, you can use the raise hand feature. I think if you click on participants in the Zoom, you can raise your hand. I'll keep an eye out for that. And I will make sure that I share my slides after the session with Fortune, who can hopefully circulate those with everybody who has attended. So with that, we will get started. In terms of what we're hoping to work on today, we will provide the content, the tips and tricks. We'll get some hands-on practice and provide more resources. But what we're really asking from you today is that you do participate. I will be asking questions of the audience. I find it a lot more engaging if you're really thinking and listening and thinking along like that. And again, ask questions. If there's something that you're not familiar with, I realize there's a range of experience when it comes to systematic reviews. Please make sure that you stop me and ask any questions that you have. So with that, starting with the very basics, I will do this very, very quickly. But what is a systematic review? We're going to be talking about rapid reviews, and it's all grounded in systematic reviews. So I want to make sure we're all starting on the same page here. So according to Cochrane, who are the world leaders in systematic reviews, a systematic review looks to identify, appraise, and synthesize all of the evidence that answers a specific research question. And the way that that's done is with explicit, systematic methods that try to minimize bias, so that when you are making decisions based on these findings, these findings are more reliable, robust, and valid. So you feel much more confident in the decisions that you are making. The process is likely familiar to all of you. Develop your research question, look for the evidence, and that's looking for all of the evidence, not just the evidence that necessarily agrees with what you're trying to say. Screening the results one by one for whether or not they meet your criteria. Assessing the quality, extracting the data, pulling that results together. So synthesizing the results, not only the findings of the data that you have found, but also the quality of that data, and then writing that report. And then each of these steps, by doing each of these steps the proper way, the systematic way, you ensure the validity of your review findings. And the question then becomes, what if you don't have the time? When the COVID pandemic hit, there was an absolute explosion of research evidence. I think there were about as many publications on COVID in that first half of 2020 as there were on heart disease in all of 2019. Like, it was a ton of research, and decision makers needed trustworthy evidence that was synthesized, looking at all of the studies. And the need for this evidence absolutely outweighed the capacity that anybody had to be producing this. So how can we produce these reviews without sacrificing too much of this quality? And then when I talk about different timelines, I saw a question in the chat. At the very beginning, we were doing these reviews in 5 business days. And that was, when there really was very, very little evidence on COVID-19, or at least, starting out. Now we're typically doing 2, 3, 4 months for a review, which again, sometimes doesn't feel very rapid. But when you're looking at a systematic review taking a year or more, it's definitely much, much faster, and you can be answering questions on a much faster timeline. So how can you adapt your systematic review methods? So if we look at the 7 steps that I had included before, I mean, that's really, the gold standard. That's kind of like the stallion of reviews. So this is, you're going to get the best, most detailed, balanced, and accurate in focus picture. And rapid reviews will sometimes take a different approach. They might exclude things like hand searching, gray literature. They might limit things by year or by language. They might summarize findings descriptively rather than doing something like a meta-analysis. They might use single reviewers for study selection, for data extraction, for quality appraisal. And they may present results differently, like let's say in a table rather than a full write-up. And what you get at the end is just a little bit less detailed. It's going to lack a little bit of that depth, but at least you have an answer. So you're able to make an informed decision with, of course, some caveats and limitations. When COVID-19 hit, we had to go even further, and we did things like excluding non-COVID literature. Sometimes we would find a recently done review and just look at the evidence since that review. Some folks were omitting quality assessment entirely, although we strongly recommend that that doesn't be done. And one thing that we did, our reports were bullet points. We didn't spend the time writing these eloquent, long scientific papers. There just wasn't time, and decision makers didn't have time to read that either. So you're looking more at bullet points. So what you're left with, again, is a much sparser look at the evidence. But what you can do is at least you have a bit of an answer, and then you can qualify your decisions based on this. And at least you have some overview of the evidence while you're looking at this. And all throughout this, the real theme here is the balancing between rigor versus the time that you have. So the discussion that we're going to have today is about that balance. How can you get the most in-depth, thorough picture that you can without sacrificing too much of that quality, while also balancing rapid timelines? There were often times where decision makers needed evidence yesterday. So how can we get this answer to them as fast as possible? And all throughout, we'll talk about some of the tools that we've used and that we would recommend that you check out to try and use yourself. So starting at the beginning with defining your question, we'll talk about question frameworks. We have a template that can be used for that. We'll do a little bit of practice developing a question, and then talk about developing inclusion and exclusion criteria for rapid timelines. There are things you can consider including and excluding to make sure that you limit the search results that you get, the amount of screening you have to do, and the amount of synthesis that you have. And we'll talk about then the trade-off in terms of applicability and transferability of those results. So this probably won't be too new for anybody in the audience who's ever attended anything on systematic reviews. But the way that we typically structure our questions are with a PICO or a PECO framework. So what is the effect of an intervention, which is the I, or an exposure, the E, on an outcome for a specific population? And we use this PICO or PECO framework in order to come up with the different components of our question. One template that we have relied on quite a bit comes from Health Evidence. So this is from healthevidence.org. I will put the link in the chat. And this is a tool that you can use, and it really prompts you in order to, hopefully that link works. And this prompts you through all the different considerations for each of the parts of your question. I saw a T as well for PICO. Absolutely, we're going to get to that as well. There certainly are different things that you can add to this question, which we're going to talk about in just a second. But this is a template that you can use in order to develop your question. We find that defining the question is often an iterative process. We found that we were often going back to the folks that had asked us for a review, asking, what is it that you really want? We would often get these really, really broad questions, decision makers who need to know everything about the question. And it's, okay, what are you trying to inform? What do you really need to know? And then send them a draft of the question and say, if we answer this question, is this going to answer the issue that you have? Will this inform the decision that you need to make? And that often involves quite a bit of early searching, seeing what is out there, what are some of the decisions we would need to make while screening, and then developing those inclusion and exclusion criteria. Great question from Fadila. If you do a rapid review, yes, we do include in the title that it is a rapid review. All of our titles are rapid review and then the question. So it is important to know, I think that the audience, that the reader knows that this was done rapidly, because it does impact things just a little bit in terms of the overall rigor and applicability of those findings. Thank you for posting the link in the chat. I appreciate that. So the scenario that I want to work through today, and this is just going to be an example as we go through, and this is something that we actually encountered. So in 2021, the COVID vaccines were available to adults. And Health Canada was, our governing body, was reviewing the safety of the vaccine for use in children ages 12 and under. And we were approached by the National Advisory Committee for Immunizations, which is our national body for safety of vaccines. And they wanted to know, were there any kids that should be at the front of the line when it comes to those vaccines? Was there anybody at higher risk of severe outcomes that should possibly be at the front of the line for getting those vaccines? So is there an association between certain factors in kids and severe COVID-19 outcomes? So this was the review that we were asked to do, and I think we had a month and a half to get this review done. So it was going to have to be very, very quick. I'll get back to scoping reviews in just a moment. So the research question that we came up with was, what are the risk factors associated with severe COVID-19 outcomes in kids 12 and under? So our population, fairly straightforward, kids aged 0 to 12 who get COVID-19. Our exposure here are comorbidities and sociodemographic factors. So because COVID, we had some folks asking, shouldn't COVID be the exposure? Well, that's not really what it is that's going to be affecting the outcome. Everybody we're looking at are the kids with COVID. The difference is the kids who have comorbidities or certain sociodemographic factors that put them at risk. And we're comparing that then to kids with no risk factors. So that was the comparison that we were doing. And then we were very, very strict in terms of the outcomes that we were looking at. We wanted to know this had to be serious outcomes. So hospitalization, ICU admission, so in the intensive care unit or the pediatric intensive care unit, if they needed to be intubated, so on mechanical ventilation or death. So we excluded anything that measured viral load, long COVID, and then the various symptoms that kids might include. It had to be those very serious outcomes that we had included. One approach that we often take when we are doing a rapid review, and actually probably any review at this point, is when you're trying to do this rapidly, be as specific as possible with the inclusion criteria. We did a quick scoping, like a quick search of the literature, just like a Google search, and we saw there were tons of studies on viral load, on transmission, on long COVID symptoms. And we knew that's not going to answer the question that, the Health Canada had. So we're very, very specific. Some things that you can do is possibly limit by study design. We have the pyramid, the hierarchy of different study designs. Something that you can do possibly to limit the number of results that you have to search through and actually increase the rigor is limit to study designs that appear higher up in the pyramid. You can maybe ignore case reports, case series. You can ignore the cross-sectional studies. Maybe you're only going to look at cohort studies so that you're not affected by certain types of bias. Maybe you limit to RCTs, your randomized control trials. That may be another way that you can limit the number of results that you have. Again, that's going to be fewer studies with fewer observations, but it's a way to help speed things up. One thing that is often done in rapid reviews is that you limit by the year of publication. So I think the good rule of thumb with systematic reviews is at least 10 years. For rapid reviews, you're often looking at 5. Again, you have to cut that down or you're just not going to get through those results. You can limit by setting. Are you interested in studies conducted in high income versus lower middle income countries? And limit by publication type. We know in systematic reviews, it's so important to get the balance of gray literature in addition to published research. But with a rapid review, you might not have time to wade through all of that often messier gray literature. So you might stick with published literature. And then for all of these decisions, think about how are these going to affect your review findings. If you only look at published literature, you're at risk of publication bias and having more positive results. If you limit by year of publication, you may be missing simply some studies that may still be relevant. So thinking about what is the trade-off here and what can you actually do? So for all of these considerations, you do need to consider how is this going to affect your findings, and you want to make sure that you communicate that then in your final report. I saw a couple of great questions come in the chat, so I'm just scrolling up again here. The difference between a scoping review and a rapid review, it's not quite the right question. So the difference is a scoping review versus a systematic review, and you can do rapid versions of both. So you can have a rapid scoping review or a rapid systematic review. We've done both. I'm currently working on a rapid scoping review. The difference between scoping and systematic methodology is scoping reviews tend to be much more broad, and you do a more or a less in-depth data extraction. You're often not looking at the actual findings of studies, but more the characteristics of studies. So it's a different type of study design, but you can do a scoping review in a rapid way with a lot of what we've described here. Rapid reviews are often publishable. Again, you need to be very upfront about why it was rapid, the modifications to the review process that you've done and what the limitations are. We are working on publishing some of these, and I saw a question about journals. The same journal you would publish a systematic review in, and you're just really upfront about this was done rapidly to meet this specific timeline. And here's the trade-off, and here are the limitations of this, and just be really, really upfront about that. Mind you, what we typically find when we're doing the rapid review and trying to publish it is then you need to add that introduction section, which we don't always do in a rapid report, and a full discussion section. We'll talk about writing the report at the end, and I'll talk about some of the considerations for publication when we get there. And if I forget, please remind me, but I'll make sure that I touch on that there. Which of the limits to consider or for the best trade-off? It depends. It's such an unsatisfying answer, but for a lot of these, it really depends on the question. When we get to searching and screening, I'm going to talk about the limits that we did for this review that we felt comfortable for this specific question. But it really, really depends on what you're doing. And a question, should a scoping review always lead to a systematic review? You can. We often do a scoping review to look at the literature and figure out what area should we be doing a systematic review in. We recently actually did a scoping review with our partner center at the Determinants of Health. And we looked at structural factors that affected health outcomes. And then from that, we found a number that focused on racial health inequities, and we did a systematic review of those studies. I wouldn't say always, but certainly often. And then registering a protocol for a rapid review, yes, you can do that. That certainly would be a good practice. Prospero is where you can do that. And you can also, we also host on our website a repository of rapid reviews relevant to public health. And I posted that link in the chat as well. So that is another place that you can do rapid reviews. That's where we are collecting, as the NCCMT, where we are collecting rapid reviews. So excellent questions, but I do want to get through the presentation. So I'm going to get a little bit, keep moving on. So in terms of searching, we want to talk about optimizing our search, screening software. We'll do an example, like a walkthrough of screening, and then strategies that can help you do this in a rapid timeline. So when we talk about searching, we're talking about a systematic search. This isn't just typing your question into Google and looking at the first 10 results. You're looking for all relevant evidence. Oftentimes we'll use a librarian, like a health librarian, medical librarian, because they just know exactly where to look and the terms to use. You typically search, you use a search strategy that you've recorded and planned in advance. And then for screening, you typically do that one by one. Each record, you have to look at every single record that your search pulls. The gold standard is to do this in duplicate first. At the title and abstract, just very, very quickly going through, tossing out and excluding anything that's obviously not relevant, and then looking more closely at the ones that have been left behind. One really good strategy is to work within the 6S pyramid. This is a system where you start looking at the top of the pyramid, which is going to be your most synthesized and pre-appraised evidence first. So for example, at the summaries level, these are your clinical practice guidelines. If there aren't any, you look for systematic reviews. And if there aren't any, you're going to be looking at single studies. Sometimes you'll actually find that there is a recent review that answers your question. You don't even need to do a system or a rapid review. So for example, if I'm looking at, this was a different question, but looking for delaying and preventing substance use for kids, we didn't find any summaries. There were no guidelines in the TRIP database. We found 307 reviews in health evidence. But then if we were to do this in PubMed, we've got 7,000 results. I'd rather not look at 7,000 results. So I would rather look at those 300 that are already summarized and pre-appraised in the healthevidence.org website. Those 307 reviews should include those 7,000, the relevant studies within those 7,000. Somebody has done that work for you. So some places to look for these, if you want to start looking for guidelines, the TRIP database is a really great place to start. You can filter by country. You can also find systematic reviews there. If you're looking for systematic reviews of public health interventions, I would recommend healthevidence.org. All of those systematic reviews have already been appraised for quality, which saves you quite a bit of time on the quality appraisal step. For single studies, things like PubMed, and there are a number of different places to look for gray literature. Honestly, Google Scholar, not the worst place to look for them. I know a lot of people say don't ever look at Google Scholar, but you can find abstracts for conferences, you can find regulatory documents there. It's not the worst when it comes to looking for that gray literature that you might need. In our scenario, so while we were looking for severe COVID outcomes for kids, we didn't find any relevant syntheses. There were no systematic reviews already on the topic, probably because this was so new at the time. So we searched for single studies. A couple of different things that we were able to do to, again, limit our time frame. So you have to kind of look bottom up in this. This is in PubMed. So search number one at the bottom here, we looked for COVID-19 and children and all of these different outcomes. So hospital, ventilation, intubation, ICU, et cetera, et cetera. And that was 25,000 results, which was way too many. So we realized that the term hospital with the asterisk, so hospitalization, hospitals, hospital, that was really blowing up the results. So if we got rid of that term, we were down to 5,000, which is much more reasonable. And then if we limited to 2000 to 2021, we were down to 3,000 results, which was much more manageable for our team. This wasn't the actual search. We had a librarian do it, and she did follow a lot of this logic, but she did a search, found just over 3,000 results. Deduplicating those left us with 2,500, and then our team was tasked with reviewing all 2,500 articles one by one to see, do these actually meet our inclusion criteria? So again, screening happens typically in 2 stages. First, you just look at the title, sometimes the abstract. It's called title and abstract screening, but you can do most of it based on the title. And you're quickly exclude anything that is very obviously not relevant. And then whatever you're left with goes to level 2 screening. And that's where you're looking much more closely, and you might be pulling up that full text if you need to. Both of these stages should be done in duplicate, where 2 people do this independently, and then you come together and resolve any conflicts, right? So where I said include and somebody else said exclude. There is software that can help you with this. I've done it with Microsoft Excel. I know people do it in Excel. It's miserable in Excel. There are different softwares that you can use. The example that I'm going to show today is called Rayanne. This is available for free online. I'm going to post, I'm just going to post in the chat the link to that. And I'm actually going to share my screen. I have set up an example of a few hits that we got, a few of the hits that we got for this review. So where are we? Rayanne, there we go. So if I can get a thumbs up saying that, yes, you can see the screening, the Rayanne screening. So here, what you should be able to see is at the top, the different, the list of studies. And if I click on any of these studies, I get the abstract here at the bottom. So I can use this very quickly to see the title of the study and the abstract. It's very easy to upload like a RIS or EndNote file in order to look at these. And I'm going to look at these. This one is about strategies to prevent COVID transmission. All right, well, that's not answering my question, so I'm going to hit exclude. This is about cardiac manifestations of Miss C. All right, that's a little bit closer. I'm going to hit include here, right? Again, I'm going very, very quickly. This one is about social and psychological effects of the pandemic. Not going to answer my question about severe outcomes. This one, outcomes of COVID on Latinx youth. Oh, but here it's about adolescents ages 13 to 18. Exclude that one. Here, characteristics of kids admitted to the hospital with acute SARS-CoV-2. Great, I'm going to include that one. So very, very quickly, we've done 5, right? So you can see it, you can do the title and abstract screening very, very quickly. And what's really great about this is right now, this is blinded. What will happen when I go back and unblind? So this was my example session here. I'm going to hit blind off and go back to the review, and it compares it to a second screener. So here I have example as an example for a second screener. So for the first one, we both excluded the study. For the second one, we just included, but the example screener excluded. So we'd have to talk about that one. What are we going to do with that one? And for the other ones, we have agreements. So we can very easily see we've excluded the same ones and included the same ones. And you can see very easily where you have conflicts. I can filter by the ones that we've both included, both excluded, or where we've had a conflict to resolve those conflicts. So again, this is available. It is free. It is online. It's not the very best software. Again, it's free, but this is what is available to you online. I'm going to go back to my slides now. There we go. So again, just an example of what that can look like and some of the things that are available to you. So after doing some of our screening, what we found was we screened these 2,500 reviews. 156 of them made it through to the second round, so they weren't excluded very, very quickly. And then of those, 52 were included. Oops, there's the link again for the software. 52 met our inclusion criteria. 52 articles is a lot of evidence. So can we reduce this set? How could we reduce this set in a way that would help, minimize our bias, right? So what we ended up doing was we looked through this set. We removed any studies that had less than 50 participants, because these were often just case reports. And we were able to remove and be left with 35 studies after that. And then again, because we were working on informing a strategy in Canada, we removed studies that were conducted in low and middle income countries. So that left us with 16 studies. 16 was way more manageable. And now if anybody has talked about, systematic reviews and having a protocol in place beforehand, sometimes, you're screaming, you're not supposed to change your question after searching. This sometimes happens with a rapid review. So I've altered our PICO. I've put in blue text here, the changes that we've made. And again, we're going to be very, very upfront about the changes that we made when we write up this report, with a rationale and a reasoning for doing this, and then what the implications will be on our overall finding. So again, I know I'm moving quickly, but there's a lot to get through in this hour. So there is a recording and the slides will be shared. I see that there's a Google group and everything handled being shared, so that's wonderful. Other software you can use, covidence.org it's paid. They do, I was looking at it yesterday, they do have pricing for review teams that are in low and middle income countries. I don't know what the pricing is offhand, but you can check it out. They support not only screening, but they have forms in there for data extraction, quality assessment, and they actually build your Prisma flowchart that shows all the studies you included. It'll build it for you, which is amazing. Distiller, I don't know about pricing, about discounts for low and middle income countries, but again, they also have data extraction, quality assessment, and they actually integrate artificial intelligence. We've been using now Distiller for a couple of years now. And it works pretty well. It took us a very long time to trust the artificial intelligence, but there is a lot of support through Distiller, through the company that runs this, for using AI. So if that is something you're interested in, that is something that you could possibly look at as well. We've now gotten to the point where we know, let's say we have 10,000 reviews. We'll screen, let's say, 2,000 of them, and then the AI says, we're pretty sure that you have 99% of all the articles that you need. And we'll say, okay, and we're done. And we won't even screen those last 8,000. So it really, really does help if you are comfortable and have managed to figure out how to use that artificial intelligence. Oh, and I see a comment from Fortune. Covidence is free for LMIC researchers. That's wonderful. I'm glad to see that. Covidence is also excellent. I've used it for a number of reviews, and it really, really is very, very helpful. And because it's so popular, you can find like guides on how to use Covidence from like different library websites and that type of thing. So there's lots of support for those. So when it comes to searching and screening, how can you speed this up and make it rapid? So number one tip is look for synthesized evidence first. You can find pre-appraised systematic reviews on healthevidence.org. And those are, again, limited to public health interventions, but if that's what you're looking at, it's a great place to start. You may, if you find a recent systematic review, you may be able to update that review and only search from their search date, right? So if there's a review that searched in January 2023 and you need the most recent evidence, you only have to search the last 8 months. And that will cut down the screening that you need to do. A couple other things that you can do. And one thing that we do is we use a single screener at level 1, as well as at level 2. And again, that's not what you would properly do on a systematic review. You are at risk of losing studies that way. However, we've decided that that's a risk we're willing to take to meet our deadlines. So we will use a single screener at level 1 and at level 2. So oftentimes what we'll do to help improve that is we'll take a small set. So let's say we have, 1,000, we'll do the first 50 in duplicate, make sure we have good agreement, and then let one person do the remaining 1,000 studies. We also have been using artificial intelligence, and I put a star here. This does take specialized software, a bit of practice, and you need a big enough set that you can train the artificial intelligence, right? If you only have 50 studies, there's not enough there for it to learn what it is that you're looking for. You need at least a couple thousand in order for AI to really, really be helpful. So again, how do these decisions affect our review findings? There's a risk with a single screener that you may be missing studies, and that's just one of the trade-offs that you have to do. That's something that we've been relying on. We know that we have some very, very good team members who are doing this, but there's a chance that something will be missed. And we do use the artificial intelligence. Again, it's not perfect, so the biggest risk is that you will be missing a study. Again, not ideal, but it's better to have 18 of the 20 studies than nothing in order to answer your question. So moving on to the next step, although I'm just going to scroll up and see if there are any questions I need to answer. I think most have been answered in the chat. So that's perfect. Okay, I think most questions have been answered. Fortune, if you can help make sure that any questions are coming through as well, that would be really helpful because there's quite a bit of chat and I can't quite keep on top of all of it. Thank you. So in terms of the next step in the review process is appraisal. We know that there are rapid review teams that skip appraising the quality of the evidence. We encourage you not to skip this step. The review is only as good as its included studies. So you can do a absolutely perfect review, but if you have very, very weak studies, your findings are only going to be so strong. So you need to appraise for the relevance, for the trustworthiness, and the applicability of your study findings. We typically, the way that the appraisal process will work, you take the studies that you have found, you figure out what research design is this, which is surprisingly not the easiest thing to do. We find that authors will often label their studies in some ways, but it doesn't quite fit. There are tools that you can use online in order to, we're actually developing one at the NCCMT. So if you sign up for our newsletter, you'll see this. I believe we are going to be announcing it in September. We've come up with like a decision tree for research designs. Maybe I'll post the chat for our newsletter sign up. But what you can do then is, based on the different characteristics of a study, decide, okay, this is the research design. Based on that design, you're going to choose your critical appraisal tool. Typically, you will appraise in duplicate, again, like everything's always done in duplicate for systematic review, and then resolve conflicts. And one thing that is optional here is you can assign a quality label. So let's say your critical appraisal tool scores something out of 10. You might say anything that scores a 4 or below is weak. Anything that scores a 5, 6, or 7 is moderate. Anything an 8 and above is strong. And that can sometimes be helpful when you're then trying to figure out and make sense of your data. I have a question here about software or app to critically appraise studies in less time. Yes and no. There's no AI to do it yet, unfortunately. I think there are some groups working on this. Your best bet is to find something that's already been critically appraised. Let's say you can find something in healthevidence.org. There are softwares that can help you organize your critical appraisal results. So actually, why don't I skip ahead here? So what we typically do is we will do it in Microsoft Excel. This is one of those things where it's kind of just easier to do that way. Team members will save separate versions, and then you merge the results, and then you look for conflict. So here's an example of 2 studies. We had a study by McKay and a study by Anakpo. The link to the study, the link to the tool that we were using, and then you can see raters NS and AT were 2 members of our team. For the 10 different questions, yeses and nos, They've recorded their results or their notes, and then the consensus. So you can see for question number 8, for that first study by McKay, there was a conflict where Nayab, I believe, put no, and Andrea put a yes. So we had to resolve possibly that conflict. So we often just do it in Microsoft Excel because it does take some time to set these up. What you can do is use Covidence software, which I've just found out is free probably for most of you, or Distiller. And then what that would do is you would record your results, somebody else would log in and record their results, and the software would then merge the results and identify conflicts for you. The issue there is that you have to set up the questions. So it's not like you can just say, oh, use the CASP tool or the JBI tool. You have to type in the questions and say, you know, question 1 has to be, was there a clear question? Question 2 is this and this and this. So it can take a bit of time to set up. If you have a ton of studies, it's worth it. But if it's a smaller review, it's probably not worth your time. So in terms of the different tools that you can use, if you're looking specifically at research evidence, at guidelines, so at the clinical practice guideline level, the Agree-To tool is, I think, the agreed upon, you know, world standard when it comes to guidelines. It's a fairly lengthy tool. It does take some time, but there are quite a few different tips and tricks throughout the document and on what to look for each of the questions. For systematic reviews, we often actually suggest that you use the Health Evidence Quality Assessment tool. This one was written for novice appraisers, particularly those in public health. The other tool that you could possibly use is the AmStar tool. So I might actually just type that in here, the AmStar tool, because that is one, if you're not working in public health, that one may be useful as well. So it's AmStar. I'm going to type that in the chat as well. And that one you can Google as well, and it'll come up for you. But that's a tool that you could possibly use as well. And then for single studies, you can often use what are called the CASP checklists. CASP stands for Critical Appraisal Skills Program. It's run out of the UK, and they have different checklists for randomized control trials, cohort studies, cross-sectional studies, etc. So lots and lots of checklists there. Those ones were actually designed as a teaching tool. So again, if you are fairly new to critical appraisal, there's a lot of tips and tricks that are available to you in there. If you're looking at community level evidence, so let's say it's gray literature, or you're looking at something that is not necessarily in the published research literature, you could use possibly the CASE tools. These were tools that were developed by the NCCMT in order to help folks that were working in public health and using community level evidence in addition to research evidence. So those might be something that you could use as well there. So again, the appraisal process, we typically do it in Excel. You can use other software. What I wanted to touch on today is how can you very quickly look at a review and decide, is this worth reading or is this not so great? So if you're very, very quickly looking at review level evidence, what you can typically do is look for, is their search okay? Did they look at least 2 major databases? And did they at least talk about gray literature? So either searched for it or justified why they didn't search for it. This is going to help you. I mean, if it's not a good search, you're not going to have all of the evidence. So this is something where, you know, it really has to have a good search or it's not going to be worth reading that review. In terms of another bit of, in terms of looking at reviews very, very quickly to decide, is this worth reading? Another key point that I look at is, did the authors consider the quality of included evidence, which ties in really, really nicely to our theme right now on appraisal. You have to appraise the individual studies that you have. And not only appraise the individual studies, but then when you come up with your overall findings, you need to determine how does that affect the weighting of evidence, right? So if you are looking at a case report and comparing that to a randomized control trial, well, the randomized control trial should have more weight, assuming it's well done, than a case report. So it's really, really important that not only are you looking at the individual studies, but also weighing the evidence as a whole and determining how confident can you be in that evidence as a whole. So coming back to the scenario that we were looking at, the studies that we all found were cross-sectional. So they were all studies of, we looked at, let's say, 300 kids admitted to this hospital for COVID. This is how many had an underlying risk factor. This is how many didn't. So that was mostly the study design that we were looking at. So there was going to potentially be some bias in there. There was going to be some sampling bias. There was going to be possibly measurement bias, underreporting of different risk factors. So what tools can we use to appraise these studies? Again, I've already mentioned the CASP tools. We've been using in our rapid reviews the Joanna Briggs Institute tools. We find that these tools for rapid reviews are sometimes a bit easier, mostly because there's no open-ended questions. You get a yes or no for everything, so you get a final score at the end, which makes things a little bit easier. Oh, I see a quality assessment tool for rapid reviews. I'll come back to that in just a second. When we did our critical appraisal, this is what we found. So I've included just a subset here just so that they fit on the slide, but here are 7 of the studies. They all had clear inclusion criteria. Some of them described the subject and setting in enough detail. All the studies measured both the exposure and the condition in a valid and reliable way. Some of them identified confounders, and some of them then handled those confounders. So confounders are third factors that could affect both the risk of the exposure as well of the outcome. They all measured outcomes in a valid and reliable way, and most of them did appropriate statistical analysis. So given this table, what does this mean for our review? How does that impact our findings? Well, for the first one, if the subjects and settings are not necessarily described in detail, we're going to have a bit of trouble later on applying this to our target population. If we don't really know what were these settings, who were the kids that we were looking at, it's hard to know, are these going to apply to the populations that we were looking at in Canada, and the populations at risk of COVID and the folks that were lining up for these COVID vaccines. So it affects often our transferability and applicability of those results and our judgment of applicability of those results. In terms of confounders, so what does it mean if confounders aren't identified or aren't handled? Again, confounders increase the risk of having a risk factor and of having those outcomes. So in this case, it would be something like, let's say something like where you live. Exposure to environmental toxins are going to increase your risk of having a comorbidity or a risk factor, as well as your risk of having a severe COVID-19 outcome. And a lot of the studies didn't necessarily take that into account. So, so what is that actually going to do? Oh, and yes, this table is based on the Joanna Briggs Institute tool. Yes, I've just kind of made the questions a bit shorter at the top. So again, with a cross-sectional study, we can't really determine causation, and we're going to be just that much more wary of how strong is this association if we haven't handled confounders in a bunch of the studies, in I think almost half of the studies. And then our last one, if the statistical analysis wasn't done properly, well, you're really going to have some doubts about those results. Oftentimes it was things like they weren't reporting confidence intervals, and that type of thing. We're not statisticians on our team, so we look for things like, does this make logical sense? Do they report their confidence intervals? And for some of them, it didn't quite. And that's why we thought, okay, this wasn't necessarily great. So for those, we're then just a little bit concerned about those overall results. So in the end, how do these critical appraisal results impact our overall conclusions? Well, we're going to be a little bit concerned about being able to apply this to our population, and we're going to be a little bit concerned that there's a bias towards seeing an association between exposure to these risk factors and COVID outcomes, because confounders weren't handled. So we don't know necessarily, was it the risk factors that led to these outcomes, or was it a confounder? So again, this is going to be something that we're going to have to talk about when we are putting together our final report. For reviews, you also will need to know what was the quality. So if you're doing a review of reviews, what's the quality of the included single studies? And we're going to come back to that in the synthesis step. So how can you do this quickly? Again, we say don't skip it entirely. We really, really don't think that that's a valid way to be able to do this. Things to consider would be just have one person do the appraisal. Somebody who's comfortable doing the appraisal and confident doing it, they might be able to do it on their own. Or do a second appraisal, but they can be unblinded. One thing that we often do, we'll have a junior member of the team do the appraisal, and then a more senior member of the team check that appraisal. So they're not blinded, they can see what the first person said, so it goes a little bit more quickly, but we do have somebody else check those. Can you do it together? Probably. I find sometimes that doesn't actually speed things up because you're trying to stay on pace with the other person. Everybody does it a little bit differently, but it would be possible. Yes, you could do it together. And then another thing that we've been doing has been conflict resolution for the quality ratings rather than the actual scores. So in the example, sorry, I'm going to go back to the example that we had here. So in the example, there was a conflict at question 8, but the overall scores were 6 and 7. Both of those are considered moderate quality. So we didn't actually bother resolving that conflict. If the difference was between a moderate and a high rating, then we would resolve the conflict, or between low and moderate. But if it's still within that same weak, moderate, strong bucket, we don't bother resolving those conflicts. We decided that is good enough. So that is one way that we have been increasing our speed when it comes to reviews. How do these decisions affect review findings? Well, you want to know how strong is the evidence that you're looking at. And here it's, again, you are possibly going to be imparting bias. Depending on who's doing this, they're going to be seeing things, they might be missing things. I find that oftentimes, if you're doing these very quickly, you will miss certain things and actually end up rating studies more harshly, and they come out as lower because, oh, I didn't see where they did this, or oh, I didn't see where they talked about confounders, right? So again, thinking about how is this going to affect your confidence in the overall review findings. And then finally, we have 25 minutes left in our session. We're going to talk about bringing this all together. So once you have done your critical appraisal of all the studies and figured out which studies you're including, we need to actually finally, you'll notice, we haven't actually looked at what are the results of the included studies. And we're going to talk about how to best communicate those results and our recommendations. So of the included research, what are those overall conclusions and overall findings? We use a data extraction table or form typically to organize those results. We typically do this in duplicate, again, resolving conflicts if there's any differences. You can use a table or a form. Again, you can use Microsoft products like Excel or Word, or things like Covidence or Distiller. Again, you just have to set up your forms in those software. And oftentimes what we recommend is that you test and calibrate whatever form or table it is that you come up with. Do 2 or 3 studies together and make sure that you're reading and interpreting things the same way, because you don't want to go off and do 50 studies and realize we weren't actually pulling the same things from these studies because you'd interpreted something differently. And then if you're doing a review of reviews, extract and consider the quality of the included studies in those reviews. That's an additional thing that you want to be looking at. An example of data extraction for single studies. This was actually from a systematic review that we had published just over a year ago, I think, at this point. These were the structural interventions for racial health inequities. So here our table looks like we've got our study design, the setting, what the intervention was, the sample size and who was in that sample, where the data was collected from, the different identities, the comparators, the outcomes, and only then finally are we looking at what were the findings of this study. And then for quality, we've used those overall labels rather than the actual score. So those ones all came out as moderate. This was done in duplicate. We had two summer students working with us at the time. So the two summer students went and did the data extraction. And then I was the third reviewer and I did any conflict resolution between those two reviewers. For reviews, data extraction looks a little bit different. In terms of dates, you probably want to include what was their search date. There's often a bit of time in between searching for evidence and then actually publishing the report. So you want to know the evidence is current up to their search date, not necessarily the publication date. Include a description of the included studies and then a summary of their findings. And again, what is the quality rating of the review itself? And then what was the quality rating of those included studies? This was one that we had done, I think, on vaccine acceptance and hesitancy in different populations, I think. And you can see we had a quality rating of the first one. The synthesis was a low quality, probably because they didn't do any quality rating of their included studies, which you see in that final column. And the second one came out as a moderate. When you're trying to then look at these very, very large tables, how can you make sense of this data? So for example, in that first table that I showed, this table went on for 8 more pages. So it was huge. How can we make sense of any of this and actually make any overarching conclusions? Typically, I will do this. I like doing this in Excel, in Microsoft Excel. You can use other programs. I look for patterns. I will sort the data. I'll color code the different squares. I'll have different tabs where I've sorted things by intervention. I've sorted by population. I've sorted by study quality and looking to see, are there any patterns there? Read through the summaries of all the studies. Reflect, was there something that stood out? Was there one study maybe that was different or a couple studies that were different from many of them? And if you're working in a team, do this individually and then bring this together with your group. Everybody's going to see different things when you're looking for patterns. Everybody's brain works a little bit differently. So it can be really helpful to then collaborate. And I will point out here that meta-analyses are not typical for rapid reviews. If you're doing a rapid review, they'll often be narrative or descriptive of the findings. Typically, because of the rapid timelines, we're not doing that meta-analysis just because there's that much more statistical magic you need to work in order to do a meta-analysis. So coming back to our example, here are a couple of the studies that we had found when we were doing our review. So again, we're looking at the association between risk factors and severe COVID outcomes. So the first study was done in Germany on 1,500 kids less than 12. They looked at comorbidities and found a much higher risk of ICU admission. Guzman in the US, they looked at 200 kids and also found I think a only slightly higher risk of ICU admission for comorbidities, right? So how can we look at this and come up with any type of conclusions without doing a full meta-analysis? So again, we looked at this, we looked for patterns. What did most of them say? What was the quality of those studies? What did the higher quality studies say rather than the lower quality studies? And in the end, what we ended up finding was that 11 studies looked at kids with any comorbidity, and there was definitely an increased risk of severe outcomes. Those risk ratios were very high. We felt confident in saying that that is likely. What we looked at was 4 studies at the relationship of age with comorbidities, and that was a little bit unclear. There were some studies that showed a much higher risk for kids aged 1 year and younger, so infants, but it was much more difficult to see, was there a really, really clear trend there? A meta-analysis may have found that. But again, this was a rapid timeline. We had a month and a half. We weren't able to do that meta-analysis. And then there were only 3 studies that looked at race and ethnicity and social and structural inequities. And there may be an increased risk. There probably is, but based on that evidence, we really couldn't see whether or not there was a strong association between that risk. And that's how we pulled together our findings. Our reports. When you're writing a report for a rapid review, you don't necessarily, again, depending on the audience, depending on who has asked you for this review, you don't always need to do the full manuscript style academic type of report with the introduction and all of that formatting. We typically, when we produce these, we will come up with an executive summary with key findings, an overview of the evidence and limitations. And all of that is organized in several bullet points. Some examples of these I can post in the chat. You can take a look at these. This review will be up there as well. But you can take a look at some of the examples, and these are much more abbreviated reports than you would see for a full publication. Things that you can do: limit your intro to a few sentences, say the rationale for the review, a quick summary of what's known, and leave it at that. Again, you're trying to get this out the door. You can present your findings in tables, in bullet points. You don't necessarily have to do that full results section, that full discussion. We omit the discussion section. We leave it with those key findings in the executive summary, and that's it. There simply isn't time to be doing that discussion section. Now, I'm going to come back to those questions that we had about publishing. And the biggest difference here is that if you want to be publishing this review, you will need an introduction and a discussion section. So for the rapid reviews that we have then turned into publications, the biggest time that we spend is writing that introduction and writing the discussion, because we haven't, compared this to the context, compared to other studies and that type of thing. We just haven't done that in our rapid review, looking strictly at the evidence that we have found. Oh, thank you for posting that link. So that's typically the hurdle that we have to pass in order to actually publish our reviews. So I'm hoping that this was helpful in terms of a discussion of that balance between rigor and time, and some of the tools that you can be using along the way that will help speed things up. There are a number of additional resources. We do host online learning modules. If you are not super familiar with critical appraisal, 4 of these modules walk you through critical appraisal of research studies. There's a systematic review one, there's a randomized control trial one. They give you actual papers, they tell you what to look for in the papers, and then they actually give you those the answer, so you can compare your answer to their answer. We also have a rapid review guidebook. I put an asterisk here because we are working on updating it. This guidebook was written in 2019 before we did all this work with COVID-19 reviews. So it's still accurate, but there's more to add. We didn't have artificial intelligence at that time. We didn't use citizen review at that time. So there's lots of things that we're doing now that we weren't doing then. You can still use the guidebook, but just know that there are some elements that might not be reflected in that guidebook. And we've also published our methods. So this is a paper that was published back in 2021 on how we developed our, what we call our rapid evidence service, which is the team that does all of these reviews. I'm happy to open it up for some question and answer now. I know there is a webinar feedback form, which I think has been posted in the chat as well. But I am very, very happy to take any questions that you might have now. I'm going to scroll up. I see a question about how long it takes to do a rigorous rapid review. The answer is always, it depends. At the very beginning of the COVID pandemic, we were able to do these in 5 business days. Now there is so much more evidence, and we're typically looking at more like 2 to 3 months. I think there was one we did this year that was just huge, and it took us about 6 months. So again, it depends. But you are looking at a shorter timeline than the year or two that you would for a systematic review. I see the social media. Okay, yeah. What's the difference between a scoping review and the systematic review? There are some key differences here. The biggest difference is the question that you're asking. So a systematic review is often looking at effectiveness or association. So how effective is a given intervention, or what is the association between a risk factor and an outcome? That's something you can answer with a systematic review. A scoping review asks more about, what do we know about an intervention? What types of interventions are people doing? What are the different topic areas that people are studying? So it's more a summary of what literature is available rather than the findings of that literature. So an example of a scoping review, I tried to give it before, was we wanted to know, what do we know about, what structural interventions have we looked at for health inequities that are at the structural or policy level? We didn't know, what policy domains are there. So we did a scoping review of, and we looked and we saw there were some that were more financial policies, nutrition policies. There were some on family health. And then we didn't look at, what were the results? What did those policies achieve? But at least we knew these are the different policies that people have tried and investigated. And from that, we did a systematic review of a subset of those. So the scoping review answers a very different question. The search tends to be broader. They tend to include more studies. We're working actually on a rapid scoping review right now for the Public Health Agency of Canada. They wanted to know, what are the latest innovations in public health surveillance? So we're doing a scoping review. We have just over 900 studies included, but we're not looking at what the studies found. We're just saying this study looked at big data or infodemics, or it looked at mobility surveillance. Like, what are the different types of surveillance and what are they surveilling? So again, you're not looking at the findings, you're just looking at what is out there and you're summarizing it rather than doing a true synthesis of the findings. And those are the biggest differences between scoping reviews and systematic reviews. I think the best resource right now for scoping reviews is the Joanna Briggs Institute. They offer a lot of guidance. The same way there's a Cochrane handbook for systematic reviews, there is a Joanna Briggs Institute handbook for scoping reviews, and that's something that would be available for free online. Is there a minimum number of authors? I mean, I would say at least 2, because there's so much you need to be doing in duplicate. Having too many people can be tricky, but it's often helpful to have more than one author, have somebody to collaborate with, bounce your ideas off of. You'll often run into things and say, am I interpreting this right? Is this the right decision? And have somebody to talk about this with. I often, if I see a systematic review with one author, I think, how did this person do this right? If you couldn't have done this in duplicate. So for me, I think the minimum number is at least 2, although I'm sure there are exceptions to that rule too. Can you do a systematic review of prevalence? Yes. You would probably want to do a meta-analysis then there as well, but you could certainly do one of prevalence. Although I think, I'm not sure if you'd want to be looking at, maybe you'd want to look at literature for that. I'm thinking whether or not you want to be looking at research literature or something like epidemiological data and doing that to estimate prevalence. But yes, I think you could do one on prevalence. Can a rapid review include meta-analysis? Yes. They typically don't. There's no rule to say that you can't. Typically, it's just you don't have time to do it. You can do it. There are software like RevMan that will do the meta-analysis for you. You plug in your numbers. But again, it's typically beyond the scope of what's done in a rapid review. What are the limitations of a rapid review? everything we just discussed. So oftentimes it's this trade-off between the rigor. You're not doing as thorough a search. You may have a single screener. You may have a single person doing the data extraction or the quality assessment. So again, you just might be more prone to bias, more prone to error. You may have to have a much smaller focus, right? So we limited our review to high-income countries. This review is not going to be useful for low and middle income countries. So we've limited ourselves in that way, right? So you may limit the applicability by having a very, very tight focus. Oh, great question about, are there any studies that support the conclusion of rapid reviews that are consistent and not contradictory with subsequent meta-analyses using the same studies? Great question. There has been some work done in this area. I'm going to type a name in here. Andrea Trico, I believe, has done reviews of rapid reviews. And I don't have it handy, but I put her name in the chat so you can look her up. She has done some reviews, I think, comparing the results of rapid reviews with the results of systematic reviews. And for the most part, it's roughly the same. But I think there certainly are some differences. And I think the biggest challenges are the level of certainty and the applicability of those results. I think we'll typically find similar results. Like if a rapid review says, yes, this works, yes, there's an association, the systematic review might actually find the odds ratio for that or the risk ratio for that, right? So it probably won't contradict, but you'll certainly just have more from the meta-analysis. Ooh, I don't know the question about tools for accessing full texts of studies in low-income countries. That's probably a question for Fortune. Unfortunately, that's not something I am interested in, or not something that I'm aware of. Very interested in, sorry, but not something that I am well-versed in. Perfect. Oh, is there assistance if you want to give a rapid review a go? Yeah, so we're happy for like small consults. We are a small team. There are about, I think, 12 people on our team. So we're not very big. We are happy to, if you want to email us, we can answer questions. Absolutely. I will put my email in the chat in case you have any questions, as well as our general email in case you have any questions. So those are both in the chat now. So I think there are some internships I saw posted as well. So I think if you sign up with Fortune and their group, they would probably be able to help you as well. You don't always have to follow a rapid review with a systematic review. No, a rapid review is often enough in order to answer your question. In the example that was given, we did find some association. The decision was made that the rollout would be done of COVID vaccines would be done for all children. There wouldn't be a staggering or for anything for kids with higher risk factors. And then we had our decision and we didn't need a systematic review. That window had passed. The group that needed the answer got their answer, made their decision, end of story. So if we wanted to publish it, maybe we would do a systematic review. But for that particular scenario, we were done. And there wasn't a need for doing a systematic review. Yes, and thank you. I am doing another session with this group, which I'm very excited about, on September the 7th, about using rapid reviews. And the focus there will be on, if you are a decision maker or a knowledge user, how can you look at a rapid review and know what are those limitations, again, what we've talked about a lot today, and how can that impact your decision making, and how do you know how trustworthy a rapid review is? And then how can you combine those findings possibly with other sources of evidence? So that's what that one will be about as well. Oh, and then the sources on scoping review online, I'll see if I can type that in, but that's through the Joanna Briggs Institute. So I'll type that into the chat, Joanna Briggs Institute, scoping reviews. handbook. I think if you Google that, you should be able to pull it up. Great. And it looks like there's a ton of networking and collaboration happening in the chat, which is wonderful to see, but I think I have gotten to all the questions. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Fortune. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much. This is such an engaged group. I am so looking forward to seeing what members of the group produce. Again, feel free to reach out if you do have any questions. Our website and our email address are on the screen. And I did put my email earlier in the chat if you wanted to contact me directly. But I will pass it over to Fortune for any closing remarks. And huge thank you for this invitation. I've really enjoyed the session.
All right, thank you very much, Claire. And I really enjoyed the session too. Okay, to the participants, we are considering a sort of mentorship program on rapid reviews, and this is something we have to discuss with Emily and her team. And if this opportunity exists, then we'll let you know. So for now, we can say you should join our WhatsApp community and at least Google Group community, and especially the WhatsApp community, because we will post this kind of updates there. And because it may not be a very big project, we may not post on our social media handle like Facebook and Twitter. So we will most likely post only on our social media platforms, on our WhatsApp community and Google Group platforms. And then for opportunities to collaborate on systematic reviews and meta-analysis, yes, that happens a lot on our community platforms. And if you join the community groups, then you would access some of these opportunities. People usually call for collaborators, and they work on different projects, systematic reviews, grouping reviews, and I believe we'll start having projects on rapid reviews now. I don't know if there is any question, but then we have a call for internship ongoing now. We are working with Evidence Aid to translate systematic reviews to plain language summaries, and we have very limited slots. And incidentally, today is the deadline, so I think you have till 11:59 p.m. GMT to apply. So please do follow NCCMT on their social media handles, because like us, they do lots of training on systematic reviews, rapid reviews, and generally evidence synthesis. And please write to Claire or write to our email if you have any question. Please let me know if there is any other thing I have not responded to. Okay, then like we said, there is a certificate for this webinar. And if you have filled the post-webinar feedback, then you should be getting a certificate from us as soon as possible. So we are giving a certificate for this session and a certificate for the session on September 7. The session on September 7 is on using rapid reviews. Okay, we have someone's hand raised. Please go ahead. Yeah, sorry, we cannot add anyone to the group. You have to join with the link. Dina, please, could you share the links again? Thank you.
Hi. Hello.
Yeah, go ahead, please. Yes, thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for organizing this webinar and your team. I'm really so grateful. Because I have a question about the call for the interns. In one of the eligibility criteria, I saw you have to be an active participant of AC SRM. I'm not too sure about that. How about if you're just joining maybe through the webinars for the first time? Could you still apply for it?
Yes, please, you can apply for it. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, yes, I also want to share with us that the training materials, that's the recording and the presentation slide, will be available for those who signed up for the webinar. We'll also be sharing it on our social media platforms. I believe Claire, sorry, Emily, I don't know if you want to share it on your social media platforms as well. But whatever the case may be, if you had signed up for the webinar or you are in any of our community groups or you're following us on social media, then definitely we'll share it. Oh, all right. Thank you very much, everybody. I just want, I don't know, Dine, can you take a photo, please? I want us to have a virtual group photo, please, before we end the session.
Thank you, Fortune. Thank you, Emily. I would like to beg us to please turn on our cameras for a group photo or group photos. Thank you. Emily, please, can you end the slide? Okay.
Yes, sorry, just did.
Okay, so we are going to start in just 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. The first one is being taken.
Please, while the photos is going on, I just want to remind us that we may not be able to give you a certificate if you do not fill the post-webinar survey, and we may not attend to anybody afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. The first, I'm going to the second page. Please, our cameras on.
Okay.
Second page. Cameras on, please. Good. Beautiful. Third page. Cameras on, please. Beautiful smile. Fourth page. Cameras on, please. Okay. Please, next page, and smile, please. And the last page. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
All right.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
Over to you,
Thank you for
Fortune,
joining.
please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rosalind. And thank you, Emily, once again. Thank you, NCCMT. Thanks to all our participants all over the world. Please share your feedbacks with us and do follow us on all our social media platforms. Thank you once again. We'll be ending the meeting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Goodbye. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you too.